The September sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of Mount Olive Baptist Church as Reverend James Washington delivered what would be his final sermon. It was Sunday, September 15, 1985, and the small rural church in Cullman, County, Alabama, was packed with faithful congregants who had come to hear their beloved pastor speak. Reverend Washington, a dignified 45-year-old man with graying temples and a voice that could fill the sanctuary without a microphone, stood behind the worn wooden pulpit that had served the church for over 60 years. His dark suit was pressed, his tie straight, and his weathered Bible lay open before him as he spoke about hope in difficult times. Brothers and sisters, his voice resonated through the humid air, we must remember that even in our darkest hours, the Lord walks beside us. The road may be rough, but we are not walking it alone. The congregation, mostly elderly African-American families who had attended this church for generations, nodded and murmured their agreement. Mrs. Dorothy Collins, 78, sat in her usual spot in the third pew, fanning herself with a church bulletin. Young Tommy Henderson, barely 12, fidgeted next to his grandmother while trying to pay attention to the sermon. After the service ended around noon, Reverend Washington did what he always did. He stood at the church entrance, shaking hands and embracing his congregation as they filed out into the Alabama heat. The pastor had a kind word for everyone. He asked about Mrs. Johnson's arthritis, congratulated the Wilson family on their son's new job, and promised to visit old Mr. Turner, who had been bedridden for weeks. "Reverend Washington," called out Deacon Samuel Brooks as the last of the congregation departed, "you still planning to visit the Morrison family today?" The pastor nodded solemnly. "Yes, I promised Sarah I'd come by this afternoon. They're still grieving little Michael's passing. It's only been 2 weeks since the funeral." The Morrison family lived in a small house about 15 miles up into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through thick pine forests. Their 5-year-old son had died in a tragic accident, and the family had been devastated. At 1:15 p.m., Reverend Washington climbed into his faded blue 1982 Ford pickup truck, placed his leather-bound Bible on the passenger seat, the same Bible he'd carried for 20 years of ministry, and waved goodbye to Deacon Brooks. The truck's engine coughed to life, and he pulled out of the church parking lot onto Highway 157. The road to the Morrison house was lonely and treacherous, especially during Alabama's unpredictable September weather. Dark clouds had been gathering since morning, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. Reverend Washington drove carefully, his truck's worn tires gripping the asphalt as he headed toward the mountains. He never arrived at the Morrison house. When evening came and there was no sign of the pastor, Sarah Morrison called the church. "Deacon Brooks," she said, her voice trembling, "Reverend Washington never came by. We've been waiting all afternoon. Is everything all right?" By nightfall, word had spread through the small community. Reverend James Washington, a man who had never missed an appointment in his 20 years of ministry, had vanished without a trace. Dawn broke gray and misty over Cullman County on Monday, September 16, 1985. Sheriff Bob Riley arrived at the Mount Olive Baptist Church at 6 a.m. to find a crowd of worried parishioners already gathered in the parking lot. Deacon Brooks approached the sheriff, his face etched with concern. "Sheriff, this ain't like Reverend Washington at all," Brooks said, wringing his hands. "That man's never been late for anything in his life, let alone missed visiting a grieving family." Sheriff Riley, a stocky white man in his 50s who had known the pastor for years, nodded grimly. "We've already started looking for his truck along Highway 157 and the back roads leading to the Morrison place. Haven't found anything yet." The search party grew throughout the morning. Church members, neighbors, and even some white families from town joined the effort. They combed through the dense forests, calling out the pastor's name, their voices echoing through the pine trees. The September heat was oppressive, and the humid air made the search even more challenging. Mrs. Dorothy Collins, despite her age, insisted on helping. "That man baptized my grandchildren," she declared. "I'm not sitting home while he's missing." By Tuesday, the Alabama State Police had joined the search. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating a steady rhythm as they scanned the mountainous terrain for any sign of the missing pastor or his truck. Search dogs were brought in, but the weekend's rain had washed away most scent trails. Detective Ray Harrison, assigned to lead the investigation, interviewed everyone who had seen Reverend Washington on Sunday. The last confirmed sighting was at 1:20 p.m. when gas station attendant Billy Martinez saw the pastor's truck heading toward the mountains on Highway 157. "He waved at me like he always did," Martinez told Detective Harrison. "Nothing seemed unusual. He was alone in the truck, had his Bible on the seat next to him." The investigation revealed troubling undercurrents in the community. Reverend Washington had been an outspoken advocate for civil rights, often using his pulpit to address racial inequality. In recent months, he had received several threatening phone calls and anonymous letters telling him to stick to preaching and stay out of politics. "Some folks around here didn't appreciate the Reverend's views on integration," admitted Sheriff Riley privately to Detective Harrison. But threatening phone calls and making someone disappear are two different things. As days turned into weeks, the search area expanded. Volunteers checked every cave, every abandoned building, every possible hiding spot within a 50-mile radius. The pastor's truck seemed to have vanished into thin air along with its driver. The FBI became involved in October, treating the case as a possible hate crime. Agent Patricia Hendricks interviewed dozens of known white supremacist sympathizers in the area, but nobody would talk. The code of silence in the rural community was impenetrable. Reverend Washington was getting too vocal about civil rights, Agent Hendricks noted in her report. He had organized voter registration drives and spoken out against discriminatory hiring practices at the local lumber mill. This made him enemies. The church held a prayer vigil every evening, with hundreds of people gathering to sing hymns and pray for their pastor's safe return. The national media picked up the story briefly, but without new developments, attention soon moved elsewhere. By Christmas 1985, the active search had been scaled back. The case remained open, but with no physical evidence, no witnesses to an actual crime, and no body, there was little more the authorities could do. Reverend Washington had simply vanished, leaving behind a wife, 2 adult children, and a congregation that would never stop wondering what happened to their beloved pastor. The mystery of Reverend James Washington's disappearance became part of local folklore, whispered about in barbershops, and discussed at church gatherings. Some believed he had been murdered by racists. Others wondered if he had suffered a heart attack while driving and crashed in a remote area that searchers couldn't find. A few cynical voices suggested he had run away from his responsibilities, though those who knew him dismissed this theory immediately. 22 years would pass before anyone would learn the truth. November 12, 2007. The morning air was crisp and sharp as Marcus Thompson loaded his hunting rifle into his weathered Jeep Cherokee. At 34, Marcus was an experienced outdoorsman who had been hunting these Alabama mountains since he was a teenager. The white-tailed deer season had just opened, and he planned to spend the day in a remote section of the Bankhead National Forest, about 20 miles from where Reverend Washington had disappeared decades earlier. Marcus had heard the stories about the missing pastor. Everyone in Cullman County knew about the case. But it wasn't something he thought about often. He had been only 12 when it happened, more concerned with baseball and video games than local mysteries. The day started promising. Marcus had spotted several deer tracks near a creek bed and was following them deeper into the forest when the weather suddenly changed. Dark clouds rolled in fast, and within minutes, a cold autumn rain began falling steadily. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Marcus knew he needed to find shelter quickly. He remembered seeing a cave opening about half a mile back partially, hidden behind a curtain of kudzu vines and fallen rocks. The cave wasn't marked on any hiking maps, just a natural limestone formation typical of the Alabama landscape. Marcus had noticed it earlier, but hadn't given it much thought. Fighting through the underbrush and slippery rocks, he made his way to the cave entrance. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber inside. Marcus clicked on his flashlight and stepped carefully into the dry interior. The cave was about 15 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a relatively flat floor covered in decades of fallen leaves and debris. As Marcus settled down to wait out the storm, he swept his flashlight beam around the cavern to make sure he wasn't sharing the space with any unwelcome wildlife. That's when he saw it. In the far corner of the cave, partially buried under rotted leaves and sediment, was what appeared to be a book. Marcus approached cautiously and knelt down for a closer look. His heart began to race as he realized what he was seeing. It was a Bible, an old leather-bound Bible with gold lettering on the cover. Despite being in the cave for years, the book was remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements by the dry limestone environment. Marcus carefully lifted it from the debris, and his hands trembled as he opened the front cover. There, in faded ink on the first page, was an inscription: "Property of Reverend James Washington, Mount Olive Baptist Church, Cullman County, Alabama, presented on the occasion of my ordination, June 15, 1965. Marcus stared at the Bible in disbelief. He had found the missing pastor's most precious possession, the Bible that witnesses had said was in his truck on the day he disappeared. But how had it ended up in this remote cave, miles from where Reverend Washington was supposed to be traveling? The storm passed within an hour, but Marcus barely noticed. He examined every inch of the cave, looking for more clues. Near where he had found the Bible, he discovered several small metal objects: buttons from a shirt, a wristwatch with a corroded metal band, and what appeared to be fragments of fabric that had long since deteriorated. Marcus carefully wrapped the Bible in his jacket and made his way back to his Jeep. His hand shook as he dialed 911 on his cell phone. 911, what's your emergency? This is Marcus Thompson. I'm in the Bankhead National Forest, and I think I just found evidence related to that missing pastor case from 1985. I found Reverend Washington's Bible in a cave. Within 2 hours, the cave was swarming with investigators. Sheriff's deputies, state police, and FBI agents arrived to secure the scene. Detective Sarah Chen, who had taken over cold cases for the county, supervised the careful excavation of the cave floor. "This is definitely Reverend Washington's Bible," confirmed Mrs. Dorothy Collins, now 100 years old, but still sharp as ever. She had been brought to identify the book. "I sat in that church for 20 years listening to him read. From this very Bible, I'd recognize it anywhere. The discovery made headlines across Alabama and beyond. After 22 years, the first concrete evidence in the Reverend Washington case had finally emerged. But it also raised more questions than it answered. How had the Bible ended up in that cave? Where was the pastor's body? And what had really happened on that September afternoon in 1985? Detective Chen knew that solving this cold case would require modern forensic techniques that hadn't been available in 1985. She also knew that time was running out. Many of the original witnesses and suspects were elderly or had already passed away. The cave where Marcus Thompson found the Bible would soon reveal its secrets, but the truth behind Reverend James Washington's disappearance was darker and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The forensic team worked methodically through the cave for 3 days, sifting through decades of accumulated debris with the precision of archaeologists. Detective Sarah Chen coordinated the effort, knowing that this might be their only chance to solve a case that had haunted the community for over 2 decades. On the second day, the team made a breakthrough. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the state's leading forensic anthropologist, discovered human bone fragments buried 18 inches beneath
the cave floor.
The bones were scattered and incomplete, consistent with a body that had been hastily buried and disturbed by animals over the years. Based on the size and structure of these bone fragments, we're looking at an adult male, approximately 40-50 years old, Dr. Reeves explained to Detective Chen. The remains have been here for at least 20 years, possibly longer. DNA testing confirmed what everyone suspected. The bones belonged to Reverend James Washington. But the medical examiner's report revealed something that shocked investigators. The pastor hadn't died from natural causes or an accident. A fracture pattern on his skull indicated blunt force trauma. Reverend Washington had been murdered. Detective Chen reopened the 1985 case files and began interviewing everyone who was still alive from the original investigation. The FBI's involvement brought new resources, including advanced database searches and psychological profiling. Agent Michael Rodriguez, specializing in cold case homicides, joined the investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Henderson, the boy who had fidgeted in church during Reverend Washington's last sermon, was now 34 years old and working as a mechanic in Birmingham. When he heard about the discovery on the news, he called Detective Chen with information that had been troubling him for years. "I never told anyone this," Tommy said during his interview, "but that Sunday afternoon when Reverend Washington disappeared, I saw something. My cousin Billy and I were riding our bikes near the old logging road, and we saw the pastor's truck pulled over. There were 2 other men there, white men, and they seemed to be arguing with him." Tommy described seeing Reverend Washington standing beside his truck with his Bible in his hand, talking to 2 men he didn't recognize. One was tall and thin with a beard, the other shorter and stocky. They appeared to be having a heated conversation. "We hid behind some trees because we could tell something wasn't right," Tommy continued. The tall man grabbed the Bible from Reverend Washington's hands, and then the shorter man hit him with something. The pastor fell down, and we got scared and rode away fast. This testimony, combined with the physical evidence, gave investigators their first real leads in 22 years. Detective Chen cross-referenced the description with known white supremacist sympathizers in the area during the 1980s. The investigation led to Earl Clayton, now 67, who had been arrested multiple times in the 1980s for racially motivated crimes, but had never been convicted of anything serious. His medical records showed he had suffered a stroke 5 years earlier and was now in a nursing home with severe dementia. Clayton's former associate, Jerry Dawkins, 72, was still alive and living in a trailer park outside Coolman. When federal agents arrived to question him, Dawkins initially denied any involvement, but faced with the evidence and Tommy Henderson's eyewitness testimony, he eventually broke down and confessed. "Earl and we'd been watching that preacher for months," Dawkins admitted during his videotaped confession. "He was stirring up trouble with all that civil rights talk. We didn't mean to kill him, just scare him, make him back off." According to Dawkins, he and Clayton had staged a fake breakdown on the logging road, knowing that Reverend Washington would stop to help. It was just the kind of man he was. When the pastor approached their vehicle, they confronted him about his activism and demanded he stop his civil rights advocacy. "He wouldn't back down," Dawkins continued, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He said he was doing God's work, that he wouldn't be intimidated. Earl got mad and grabbed his Bible, said he was twisting the Lord's word. That's when I hit him with a tire iron. I didn't mean to kill him, but he went down and didn't get up." Panicked, the 2 men loaded Reverend Washington's body into their own truck and drove to the remote cave they had used for illegal moonshine operations. They buried him hastily in the cave floor, but in their rush they left behind his Bible and several personal items. To cover their tracks, they drove the pastor's truck to an isolated area and set it on fire, believing this would destroy any evidence. They then spread rumors that Reverend Washington had run away with church money, hoping to discredit his memory and deflect suspicion. Jerry Dawkins was arrested and charged with murder. Earl Clayton, due to his severe dementia, was deemed unfit to stand trial and remained in medical care until his death 6 months later. The case made national headlines once again. The Mount Olive Baptist Church, now led by Reverend Washington's son David, held a memorial service that drew hundreds of people from across Alabama. Mrs. Dorothy Collins, despite her advanced age, spoke at the service. "For 22 years we wondered what happened to our pastor," she said, her voice still strong despite her 100 years. "Now we know he died doing what he always did, standing up for what was right, refusing to back down in the face of hatred." Marcus Thompson, the hunter who discovered the Bible, attended the memorial service and was recognized for his role in finally bringing closure to the case. The Bible that had led to solving the murder was placed in a place of honor at the church, a testament to Reverend Washington's enduring legacy. Jerry Dawkins pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. At 72, he would likely die behind bars, paying for a crime that had taken not just one life, but had devastated an entire community for over 2 decades. The cave where Reverend Washington's body was found has been sealed and marked with a memorial plaque. His remains were finally laid to rest in the church cemetery, next to his wife Sarah, who had died in 1998 still believing her husband would someday come home. The case of Reverend James Washington became a landmark in civil rights cold case investigations, demonstrating how modern forensic techniques and persistent detective work could finally bring justice, even after more than 2 decades. It also served as a reminder of the courage shown by civil rights activists who faced real danger in their fight for equality, and the price some paid for standing up for what they believed was right.